I knew my son no longer saw me the same way the moment I stepped into the little stone church in Columbus and found another woman sitting in the seat marked Mother of the Groom. Susan Bennett smiled, as if she had earned that place while an usher quietly guided me toward the last row. Michael never looked at me. I thought the deepest heartbreak of the day had already happened until Pastor Samuel stopped. The ceremony looked across the silent chapel and asked one question that only I could answer. If this story touches something you've lived through, I'd love to hear from you. Please like this video, subscribe if you enjoy heartfelt family stories, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Most of all, tell me honestly, what would you have done if you were sitting in my place? My name is Eren Ozmen, and for most of my life I believed a mother's love did not need to be announced. It showed itself quietly, in packed lunches made before sunrise, in bills paid late because school fees came first, in shoes bought for a growing boy while my own winter coat stayed the same for 7 years. In every dream I folded away so my son could unfold his. By the time Michael Carter was getting married, I was 67 years old and living alone in a small 2-story house on the east side of Columbus, Ohio. The house was nothing grand, but it held everything that mattered to me. The front porch still had the white railing my husband David had painted the summer before he got sick. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon in the colder months because Michael used to beg me for baked apples after school. The hallway still carried the framed photographs of every stage of my son's life, from a gap-toothed boy in a baseball cap to a serious young man in a college graduation gown. Every morning I made coffee for one and sat by the kitchen window. It was a habit I had never managed to break after David passed. For 38 years I had poured 2 cups. After he was gone, I still reached for the second mug sometimes. Then I would remember, set it back, and pretend the ache in my chest was just age. David had been gone for nearly 18 years by then. He died when Michael was still in high school, old enough to understand death, but too young to know what it would take from us. One day, our house had been full of his laughter, his work boots by the door, his terrible singing from the garage. The next, it felt like the walls themselves had gone quiet. I remember the night after the funeral. Michael was 16. He sat at the kitchen table in the same black suit he had worn to bury his father, staring down at a plate of food he never touched. I was exhausted, numb, terrified, but I could see something in my son's eyes that frightened me more than my own grief. He looked lost. So I did what mothers do. I swallowed my pain before it could frighten him. "We're going to be okay," I told him. He looked up at me with red eyes. "How, Mom?" I did not know. Not then. But I reached across the table and took his hand. "Because I'm still here." That became my promise. I was still here when the mortgage came due, and David's life insurance covered less than people assumed. I was still here when Michael needed money for SAT prep, football fees, college applications, gas books, and clothes for interviews. I was still here when the furnace broke during the coldest January I could remember, and I slept in 2 sweaters rather than tell him how close we were to falling behind. I worked at the public library in the mornings. I cleaned offices 3 nights a week. On weekends, I helped an elderly neighbor with meal prep and errands for extra cash. There were weeks when I was so tired I would park in the driveway and sit with both hands on the steering wheel, trying to gather enough strength to walk inside and smile. Michael never knew all of it. I made sure of that. He knew I worked hard, of course, but children rarely understand the full cost of survival until they become adults themselves. He knew I missed school events sometimes because of work, but he did not know I cried in the restroom at the library after missing his final homecoming game. He knew I wore the same pair of black shoes for years, but he did not know I had returned a pair I loved so he could afford a graphing calculator. And still, I had no regrets. Michael was worth every sacrifice. He was a good boy. Truly he was. He had his father's careful hands and my stubborn heart. When he was little, he would bring me dandelions from the yard and call them sunflowers for poor people because David had once joked that love did not need a florist. When he was 12, he saved his allowance for 3 months to buy me a blue scarf for Christmas. When he graduated high school, he hugged me so tightly that I could barely breathe and whispered, "I'm going to make you proud, Mom." "You already have," I told him. When he left for college in Cincinnati, I cried for 2 days, then pretended I had allergies when he called. He studied civil engineering just like David had once hoped to do before life pulled him into factory management instead. Michael worked hard. He came home on breaks, fixed things around the house, took me out for pancakes, and called every Sunday evening. For years, Sunday was ours. Sometimes the calls were short. Sometimes they lasted an hour. He would tell me about work friends' bills and the little apartment he hated because the heat clanked all night. I would tell him about the library, the neighbors, the garden, and which old church ladies were arguing over the bake sale. We laughed. We remembered David. We stayed close in the only way a mother and grown son can after life begins pulling them in different directions. Then Michael met Olivia Bennett. At first I was happy for him. More than happy. I had prayed for years that he would find someone who loved him gently, someone who saw the boy behind the man, someone who understood that strength and tenderness can live in the same heart. When he first told me about Olivia, his voice sounded brighter than it had in a long time. "She's smart, Mom," he said. "Really smart. She works in marketing downtown. She knows exactly what she wants." "That can be a good thing," I said. "She's different." I smiled into the phone. "Different good." He hesitated just long enough that I noticed. "Yeah," he said. "Different good." The first time I met her, Olivia was polite. Beautiful, too, in a sharp, polished way. Every strand of her hair seemed to know its place. Her smile was smooth, her clothes expensive, her words carefully chosen. She brought me a bottle of wine, though I had told Michael I did not drink much, and complimented my house in a tone that made it sound like she was complimenting an antique store. "It has so much character," she said, glancing around my living room. I thanked her because I was raised to accept kindness even when it arrived wearing gloves. Michael watched us both with nervous hope, and because I loved him, I tried. I made pot roast his favorite. I baked peach cobbler. I asked Olivia about her work, her family, her plans. She answered every question but somehow gave very little away. Her parents, Richard and Susan Bennett, lived in a gated community outside Dublin. Richard owned a real estate development company. Susan served on charity boards and spoke in a voice so soft it somehow made every sentence feel like judgment. They were the kind of people who never said they were better than you. They simply behaved as though everyone already knew. Still, I told myself not to be unfair. Michael was happy. That was what mattered. For a while, he still called on Sundays. Then the calls moved to Monday because Sunday became Olivia's family dinner. Then Monday became every other week because work was busy. Then the calls became texts. "Love you, Mom. Crazy week. Call soon." Soon became later. Later became silence. I would stare at my phone some evenings, feeling foolish for missing a grown man, as if he were still a child upstairs with a fever. I would type messages and delete them. "Are you eating enough? Is everything okay? Do you still remember who you were before all this?" I never sent that last one. Instead, I sent cheerful things. Photos of the garden, a picture of his father's old toolbox after I cleaned the garage, a reminder that I was proud of him. Sometimes he replied with a heart. Sometimes he did not reply at all. When Michael called to tell me he and Olivia were engaged, I sat down before he finished the sentence. "Mom," he said. "Are you crying?" "A little," I admitted, laughing through it. "Good tears." He sounded relieved. "You're happy." "Of course I'm happy. You're my son." There was a pause. Then he said, "Olivia's parents want to help with the wedding. They know people. Venues, planners, all that. That's kind of them," I said. "They're just better at this stuff." I looked around my small kitchen at the faded curtains, the chipped mug in my hand, the old table where I had helped him with homework while worrying over bills. Better at this stuff. I knew he did not mean to wound me. That is the trouble with words from your child. Even the careless ones know exactly where to land. "I understand," I said softly, and I tried to. In the weeks that followed, wedding plans moved around me like a train I was not invited to board. Olivia had a planner, Susan had opinions, Richard had connections, Michael had less and less time. Once I offered to help with rehearsal dinner arrangements. "That's already handled," Michael said quickly. "Oh, all right, but thank you, Mom." Another time I asked whether they needed addresses for our side of the family. "Olivia's keeping the guest list tight," he said. "We don't want it getting too big, our side of the family," as if I were asking to bring strangers instead of blood. I did not argue. I had spent a lifetime making things easier for Michael. I thought this was just another version of that. If stepping back kept peace, I would step back. If smiling through small hurts helped him start his marriage happy, I would smile. But there was one thing I had not stepped away from. In the back of my bedroom closet, wrapped in an old cream-colored towel, sat a small wooden box David had left behind. It was walnut smooth and dark, with a tiny brass latch. He had given it to me during the last month of his life, when his voice had grown thin, but his eyes were still clear. "Eren," he whispered, "when Michael gets married, give this to him." I had tried to open it then, but he placed his hand over mine. "Not yet." "David, what is it?" "Things he'll need to remember." I did not understand, and I was too frightened of losing him to press for answers. Years passed. The box remained untouched. I dusted it every spring. I moved it carefully when I reorganized the closet. I thought of it whenever Michael brought a girlfriend home, then forgot it again when those relationships ended. But after Olivia came into his life, I found myself thinking about that box more often, especially after the Sunday calls stopped. Especially after my son started saying, "Please don't make this difficult," when all I had done was ask where I belonged. And on the morning the wedding invitation arrived, I stood in my quiet hallway with the envelope in my hand, feeling something cold move through me before I even opened it. Because a mother knows. Even before the truth arrives, she can sometimes hear its footsteps. The first time I drove to the Bennett home, I felt like I had crossed into another version of Ohio, one that looked polished enough to keep ordinary grief outside the gates. Their house sat in a quiet neighborhood in Dublin, where the lawns were trimmed so neatly they seemed measured with a ruler. The driveway curved around a stone fountain that did not need to exist, but clearly existed to say something. Large windows reflected the pale afternoon sky, and 2 white columns stood at the entrance like guards. Michael had asked me to come for dinner. "Olivia wants everyone to get to know each other better," he said. I had been foolish enough to feel hopeful. I wore my navy dress, the one I saved for church luncheons and funerals, and the pearl earrings David had given me on our 25th anniversary. They were not real pearls, but I loved them because he had bought them with overtime money and looked proud when I opened the box. Before I got out of my car, I checked my lipstick in the mirror and told myself not to be nervous. "You raised a good man," I whispered. "That is enough." Susan Bennett opened the door before I could ring the bell. She was tall and slender with silver blonde hair swept away from her face and a cream-colored blouse that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her smile was perfect, but it never reached her eyes. "Eren," she said, "how lovely that you could make it," as if I had squeezed them into my schedule. "Thank you for having me," I said. Inside the house smelled of lemon polish and white wine. Everything shone. Glass tables, silver frames, pale rugs, fresh flowers, and heavy vases. Nothing looked touched by real life. No stack of mail, no sweater over a chair, no coffee cup forgotten on a side table. I wondered if anyone in that house had ever cried in the kitchen at midnight, or if even sorrow had to make an appointment. Michael came down the stairs wearing a gray sweater and an anxious expression. "Mom," he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek, "you look nice." It was such a small compliment, but I held on to it. Olivia appeared behind him, graceful as always. She wore black trousers and a silk blouse, her engagement ring flashing under the chandelier. She hugged me lightly, barely touching. "I'm so glad you came," she said. "This wedding planning has been a whirlwind." "I can imagine," I replied. "I'd love to help however I can." Something flickered across her face. Not anger. Not exactly. More like inconvenience. "That's sweet," she said. "We're actually trying to keep things very streamlined." Richard Bennett entered the room, then carrying a glass of bourbon. He had a broad face, expensive watch, and the confidence of a man used to people waiting for him to finish speaking. "So this is Michael's mother," he said. I held out my hand. "Eren Ozmen." He shook it firmly. "Richard Bennett, Michael's told us a lot about you." I smiled. I hope some of it was good. He chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "He's a fine young man. Ambitious. That's rare these days." "He worked hard," I said. "Yes," Richard replied, "though I imagine joining the right family helps a man understand his full potential." The words were smooth, but I felt the edge underneath them. Dinner was served in a dining room large enough to hold my entire living room. The table had candles, linen napkins, and plates with gold rims. I sat across from Susan between Michael and an empty chair that Richard later filled after taking a phone call about a property deal. At first, conversation stayed polite. Olivia talked about the venue, a stone church in Columbus with stained glass windows and a reception hall nearby. Susan discussed flowers like they were a diplomatic matter. Richard mentioned guest counts photographers and the kind of people who would be attending. I listened, nodding, waiting for someone to ask what I thought. No one did. Finally, when there was a pause, I said, "Have you chosen the rehearsal dinner location yet? Traditionally, the groom's family hosts it, and I would be happy to." Susan set down her fork gently. "Oh, that's very thoughtful, Eren. But we've already reserved a private room at the Whitmore Club. I had heard of it. Everyone in Columbus had heard of it. A place with leather chairs, heavy doors, and prices people did not say out loud." "Oh," I said. "I see." Richard smiled. "It's better this way. Less pressure on everyone. Everyone meant me." Michael shifted beside me. "Mom, it's just easier. Olivia's family already had the connection." "I understand," I said. That became my phrase for the evening. When Olivia mentioned the bridal shower, I said I understand. When Susan explained that they had already selected the invitations, I said I understand. When Richard said the wedding would need to feel cohesive and looked around the room as though I represented the opposite, I said nothing at all. After dinner, Olivia asked Michael to help her bring out dessert, though the house clearly had staff, because I had seen a woman in black quietly moving through the kitchen. That left me with Richard and Susan. Susan lifted her wine glass. "Michael is very devoted to you." "He's a good son," I said. "He is," she agreed. "But marriage changes priorities. A man needs to build forward, not backward." I looked at her carefully. "Family is not backward." Her smile tightened. "Of course not. I only mean that sometimes mothers have a hard time letting go." There it was, the accusation wrapped in silk. I could have told her about letting go. I could have told her about watching my husband die inch by inch while my son still needed dinner, clean clothes, and someone to clap at school awards. I could have told her about waving goodbye to Michael at college with a smile so he would not feel guilty for leaving me alone. I could have told her that letting go had been the lesson life forced on me long before she ever sat across from me with wine in her hand. Instead, I said I want Michael to be happy. Susan's eyes softened for half a second, but not with kindness, with satisfaction. "Then I'm sure you'll support what he and Olivia decide." When Michael drove me home that night, he was quiet. The city lights passed over his face in flashes. I wanted to ask if he had noticed. I wanted to ask why he had let them talk around me instead of to me. But his hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that I chose gentleness first. "They have a beautiful home," I said. "Yeah." Olivia seems excited. "She's stressed. So are you." He exhaled. "There's just a lot going on." "I know. Weddings can bring out emotions." He glanced at me quickly. "Mom, please don't take things personally." I turned toward him. "What things?" He swallowed. "Just, Olivia and her parents have a certain vision. They're not trying to hurt you." I had learned over the years that when someone says they are not trying to hurt you, it usually means they already know they have. I offered to help, I said quietly. "I know, and no one wanted me to. That's not fair, isn't it?" He did not answer. A minute later, he said the sentence that would become a wall between us. "Mom, please don't make this difficult." I looked out the window so he would not see my face. Difficult. I had buried his father without falling apart in front of him. I had worked until my feet swelled. I had stretched dollars until they screamed. I had gone without so he could go forward. I had smiled through loneliness, birthdays, holidays, and the empty chair across from me. But asking where I fit in his wedding made me difficult. "I won't," I said, and I meant it then. Over the next few weeks, I kept my promise in the only way I knew how. I stayed quiet. When Olivia chose pale champagne bridesmaid dresses and ivory flowers, I complimented them. When Susan sent an email with the weekend schedule and misspelled my last name as Ozmen, I corrected it gently once. When the corrected version came back with my name still wrong, I let it go. When Michael stopped mentioning details, unless I asked, I stopped asking as much. But silence has weight. People think quiet means acceptance. It does not. Sometimes quiet is just a person holding too many broken pieces in her hands. One afternoon, I ran into Michael at a grocery store near my house. I had not known he was in the neighborhood. He was standing in the produce section looking at apples, wearing a dress shirt and the tired expression he used to have during final exams. "Michael." He turned, and for one unguarded second, he looked like my boy again. "Mom," he said. "Hey." I smiled. "What are you doing here, meeting a contractor nearby?" "Thought I'd grab a few things." We talked for a few minutes. Nothing deep. Work, weather, the price of eggs. Then he noticed the apples in my cart and smiled faintly. "Baked apples. For myself," I said. "Unless you want some." His face softened. "I haven't had those in years. You could come by Sunday." The softness disappeared almost instantly. "This Sunday is Olivia's dress-fitting brunch." "Dress-fitting brunch?" He looked embarrassed. "It's a thing." "I see." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Maybe another time." There were so many another times between us by then that they had begun to feel like a country I could never visit. As we walked toward checkout, his phone rang. Olivia's name lit up on the screen. He answered quickly. "Hey, yeah, I'm still coming." "No, I didn't forget." His tone changed when he spoke to her. It became careful, smaller, like he was trying not to step on glass. I pretended to compare 2 brands of oatmeal while I listened. "No, I didn't tell her that," he said, lowering his voice. "I said I'd handle it." A pause. I know how important the optics are." Optics. I stood there holding a box of oatmeal, feeling something inside me go still. Michael turned away from me, but not far enough. "Olivia, she doesn't need a role. She just needs to be there." She, not Mom. She. By the time he ended the call, my hands were cold. "Everything okay?" I asked. He looked startled, then guilty. "Yeah, wedding stuff." "What did you need to handle?" His face closed. "Nothing. Michael. Mom, not here. Not here meant not ever." He kissed my cheek quickly, said he had to go, and left with nothing but a bag of apples. I stood in the checkout line behind a young mother with a toddler in the cart. The little boy kept reaching for her, and she kept handing him crackers one by one, tired but patient. Watching them, I had the strangest memory of Michael at that age, his sticky fingers clutching my sleeve, his voice calling Mama up. There had been a time when I was the whole world to him. Now I was a problem to be handled. That night I opened my bedroom closet and took down David's wooden box. I did not open it, not yet. I just sat on the edge of my bed with it in my lap, running my thumb over the brass latch. "What did you know?" I whispered to my husband's memory. The room gave no answer, but the next morning I received the first formal wedding schedule by email. And there, buried beneath ceremony timing photo sessions and reception seating notes, was one small line that told me Olivia Bennett had never intended to make room for me at all. Mother of the groom, processional Susan Bennett, escorting Michael Carter. For a while I could not breathe. Then I read it again. Susan Bennett, not Eren Ozmen, not his mother, not the woman who had raised him, fed him, prayed over him, fought for him, and loved him through every season of his life. Another woman was going to walk in my place, and my son had let her. I read the wedding schedule 3 times before I finally accepted that I wasn't misunderstanding it. The words never changed. Mother of the groom, processional, Susan Bennett, escorting Michael Carter. My eyes kept drifting back to that single sentence, as though enough staring might cause the letters to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Instead, they only became sharper. I closed my laptop slowly and rested both hands on the dining room table. The house was completely silent. For nearly an hour, I simply sat there listening to the old grandfather clock in the hallway mark each passing minute. Tick, tick, tick. I thought about calling Michael immediately. Then I imagined him at work. I imagined him answering with that tired voice he'd begun using whenever I asked questions about the wedding. "Mom, it's complicated." "Mom, don't overthink it." "Mom, please don't make this difficult." No, this conversation deserved more than another rushed phone call. I waited until that evening. At precisely 7 o'clock, I dialed his number. He answered after the 4th ring. "Hey, Mom." He sounded distracted. "Are you busy? Just finishing dinner?" I hesitated. "Did you receive the final ceremony schedule today?" There was a pause. "Yeah, I received mine too." Another pause. This one lasted longer. I noticed something. I figured you might. His answer surprised me, not because of what he said, because he already knew. You already knew I'd notice. Yeah, I swallowed. Michael. Mom. No. My voice remained calm, but even I could hear how carefully I was choosing every word. I've asked almost nothing throughout this entire engagement. I know. I haven't argued about the venue. I know. I haven't complained about the rehearsal dinner. I know. I've tried to stay out of every decision. I know. I closed my eyes. So please explain one thing to me. Silence. Why is another woman walking you down the aisle as the groom's mother? His breathing became audible through the phone. When he finally spoke, it was almost a whisper. It isn't what you think. I don't know what to think. Olivia's parents. He stopped. What about Olivia's parents? They feel... Another pause. They feel what? He sighed heavily. They think it'll create a smoother ceremony. I frowned. What does that even mean? They're paying for almost everything. I stared through the kitchen window into my dark backyard. So, because they're paying, it's not about money. Then explain it. He sounded frustrated now. They just think it'll look more balanced. Balanced. They're trying to avoid awkward family dynamics. I almost laughed. Awkward family dynamics. The irony was breathtaking. The awkward family dynamic, I said quietly, is replacing the groom's mother with someone who has known you for less than 2 years. Mom! No, Michael. For the first time since his engagement, I interrupted him. Help me understand. He rubbed his forehead. I knew that habit. He had inherited it from David. Susan has kind of become another mother figure. The sentence landed like a physical blow. Another mother figure, not mentor, not family friend, mother. I looked around my kitchen, every cabinet, every photograph, every scratch on the old wooden floor from when Michael had learned to ride his toy truck through the hallway. Another mother. Was motherhood something that could simply be reassigned? Could 36 years disappear because someone else hosted elegant dinner parties? I see. Those 2 words were all I could manage. Mom, don't take it personally. I almost asked him how else a mother was supposed to take being replaced. Instead, I asked something else. Did this idea come from you? Silence. Michael. No. So it came from Olivia. Yes. And you agreed. I was trying to keep the peace. I closed my eyes. There it was. The truth. Not a mistake. Not a misunderstanding. A decision. My son had chosen peace with everyone else over loyalty to me. I have another question. Okay. If your father were alive, he didn't answer. If David were standing beside you, still nothing. Would you let another man take his place? His breathing caught. That's different. Why? It just is. No. I spoke softly. It isn't. The line remained quiet. Finally, he whispered, Mom. Parents aren't decorations. He said nothing. We aren't there because we match the flowers. Silence. We're there because we spent our lives getting our children to that moment. I heard him exhale slowly. I know. No. My voice broke despite my best effort. I don't think you do. For nearly 20 seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he surprised me. I'll talk to Olivia. Hope flickered inside me before I could stop it. You will. I can't promise anything. Hope disappeared just as quickly. But I'll bring it up. Bring it up. As though my place beside him had become a negotiation. I smiled sadly, despite the tears filling my eyes. Thank you. We ended the call politely. Neither of us said, I love you, for the first time in my son's life. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was shelving books at the library. It was Olivia. That alone felt unusual. She rarely called me directly. Hello, Olivia. Hi, Eren. Her voice sounded warm. Too warm. I wanted to clear up some confusion. I'd appreciate that. I'm afraid Michael misunderstood part of our planning. I waited. Susan isn't replacing you. I almost laughed. Then why is she escorting him? It's symbolic. Symbolic of what? Unity. I remained silent. She continued, My parents have contributed so much to making this wedding possible. I appreciate that. We simply wanted both families represented. I am his family. So are we. The words were spoken gently, almost kindly, which somehow made them hurt more. I've loved Michael as my own son. I looked down at the books in front of me. Love. Such an easy word. Such a heavy one. I don't doubt that. I'm glad. But loving him isn't the same as raising him. Her tone cooled ever so slightly. I wasn't trying to compete. Then why is my name missing? Another pause. We thought this arrangement would avoid uncomfortable moments. What uncomfortable moments? Eren? No. I spoke before she could redirect the conversation. What uncomfortable moments? She sighed. My parents worry about appearances. I waited. They're hosting many business associates. Still, I waited. They're concerned that... She stopped. Concerned about what? I heard her inhale deeply. Concerned that people may ask questions. What questions? She hesitated long enough that I already knew I wouldn't like the answer. Questions about different backgrounds. Different backgrounds? I frowned. What does that mean? They simply think... She searched for words that sounded kinder than the truth. That the photographs should have a consistent look. Everything inside me went still. Photographs. She wasn't talking about personalities or traditions or logistics. She was talking about image, about appearances, about presentation. I finally understood. Susan Bennett looked like the elegant mother of the groom they wanted in every wedding album. She belonged in country clubs. She hosted charity galas. She wore designer dresses. She knew exactly which fork to use at formal dinners. I was a retired librarian living in an aging neighborhood. My dresses came from department store sales. My pearls weren't real. My hands still carried faint scars from years of cleaning offices after midnight. I didn't fit the picture. Eren, I'm here. I hope you understand. Understand. That word again. I understand perfectly. Relief entered her voice. I'm so glad. But I don't agree. The silence that followed was immediate. I have never asked to be the center of your wedding. She said nothing. I never asked to plan it. Nothing. I never asked for recognition. Nothing. I only asked to be my son's mother. Olivia finally spoke. You'll always be his mother. Then let me be treated like one. She had no answer. Instead, she quietly said, I hope you'll still attend. I looked toward the library entrance where mothers were bringing children inside for story hour. Tiny hands reached for older hands. Complete trust, complete love. I wouldn't miss my son's wedding. I appreciate that. But Olivia, yes. I hope one day if you ever have children... She waited. No one ever asks you to understand what you're asking me to understand today. I ended the call before she could respond. That evening, I walked upstairs to my bedroom. The wooden box David had left me was still sitting inside the closet exactly where I had placed it. I carried it downstairs and set it on the dining table. The brass latch caught the afternoon sunlight. I rested my hand on top of it. I promised, I whispered. I had promised David I would wait, but for the first time in 18 years, I found myself wondering whether that promise was about to matter more than I had ever imagined. I barely slept the night before the wedding, not because I was angry. Anger burns hot, then fades. What kept me awake was something quieter. Grief. The kind that settles into your chest and refuses to move. Around midnight, rain began tapping softly against my bedroom window. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of my old house. The heater clicked on. The refrigerator hummed downstairs. Somewhere outside, wind stirred the maple tree David had planted the year Michael was born. For a moment, I closed my eyes and imagined David beside me, not as he had looked in the hospital, but as he had been before illness. Strong shoulders, laugh lines around his eyes, the faint smell of cedar after working in the garage all afternoon. Whenever life became overwhelming, he had a habit of placing one hand over mine and saying, "One thing at a time, Ren." He was the only person who ever called me Ren. I missed hearing it. I missed him more on important days than ordinary ones. Birthdays, Christmas, Michael's graduation. And now, the night before our son's wedding. I finally climbed out of bed around 1 in the morning and walked barefoot to the hallway closet. The wooden box was waiting exactly where it had been for nearly 2 decades. Dark walnut, smooth corners polished by years of careful handling, a tiny brass latch that had never once been opened. I carried it downstairs as gently as though it contained glass. The kitchen light cast a warm circle across the table. Outside, the rain continued falling. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, but never drank it. Instead, I simply stared at the box. David's last gift, his last instruction, his last secret. I could still remember the afternoon he gave it to me. He had already lost so much weight by then that his wedding ring slipped loosely around his finger. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. Machines beeped steadily beside his bed, measuring time in ways neither of us wanted to acknowledge. He motioned for me to sit. When I did, he reached into the bedside cabinet and pulled out the small walnut box. "This belongs to Michael." I frowned. "Then why not give it to him now?" He smiled sadly. "Because he isn't ready." I touched the lid. "What's inside?" He placed his hand over mine. "Don't ask." "David, promise me." I looked into his tired blue eyes. When our son gets married." I laughed softly through tears. "You've already planned that far ahead." "I have to." He squeezed my fingers. "If I can't be there," his voice cracked, "then something of mine should." I leaned forward until my forehead rested against his. "You'll be there." He smiled, though I think we both knew I was lying. "If something happens before then." He paused to catch his breath. "You give him this." "I will." "But—" His expression grew unexpectedly serious. "If one day you believe he's forgotten where he came from." I looked at him. "There's a sealed envelope inside." My heartbeat quickened. "What does it say?" "Not yet." "David, promise." I nodded. "I promise." He smiled again. "I trust you." Those had been among the last complete sentences he ever spoke. 3 weeks later he was gone, and for 18 years I had kept my promise. The box remained closed, untouched, waiting. Now it sat before me in the quiet kitchen, while rain whispered against the windows. I reached toward the brass latch, stopped, pulled my hand back. I promised. My voice sounded strangely loud in the empty room. Instead of opening it, I ran my fingertips across the carved initials on the underside. D.O. David Ozmen. The letters had faded slightly over the years. Just beneath them was a tiny scratch. Michael had made it when he was 9. He had been pretending to build birdhouses in the garage and accidentally dropped a screwdriver onto the box. He cried for nearly an hour because he thought he'd ruined something important. David simply laughed. "Now it's ours forever." That memory made me smile despite everything. Michael had always loved his father, completely, unconditionally. When he was little, he followed David everywhere, into the garage, into the garden, to the hardware store, even to the mailbox. He wanted to know how everything worked, how engines started, why leaves changed color, why nails had flat heads. David answered every question as though it mattered. After David died, Michael tried very hard to become the man his father had been. He fixed things around the house. He carried groceries without being asked. He shoveled the driveway before I woke up. Sometimes I'd catch him standing in the garage holding one of David's old tools without using it, just holding it, as though somehow his father might still be there. What had happened to that boy? Where had he gone? Could love really change someone that completely? Or had life simply buried parts of him beneath ambition, expectation, and the desperate need to belong somewhere new? I wanted to believe the second explanation, because if Michael had truly stopped loving me, I wasn't sure my heart could survive knowing it. My phone buzzed. It was nearly 2 in the morning. I expected a spam message. Instead, it was from Michael. "Can't sleep. Big day tomorrow. Love you, Mom." Just 6 words. But they broke something open inside me. He still loved me. Didn't he? People don't text "love you" if they've stopped caring. Unless guilt had written the message instead of love. I stared at the screen for several minutes before replying. "Love you too. Sleep if you can. Tomorrow will be beautiful." I almost added, "no matter what happens." I deleted those words. The next morning dawned bright and cool. The rain had washed the air clean. Sunlight filtered through the maple tree outside my bedroom, scattering moving shadows across the floor. I stood in front of my closet longer than usual. 3 dresses hung there, a gray one, a navy one, and the soft blue dress Michael had once picked out with me nearly 10 years earlier. It wasn't expensive. We had been shopping for clothes before his first engineering banquet. I had admired it quietly, but put it back because I thought it cost too much. The next day, Michael surprised me with it. "You never buy anything for yourself," he'd said. "I can afford my own clothes." "I know." "So why?" He grinned. "Because I wanted to." I chose that dress. Not because it was the prettiest, because it reminded me of the sun I still believed existed somewhere beneath everything else. I curled my hair carefully, applied light makeup, fastened David's favorite necklace around my neck. Then I stood before the hallway mirror for a long time. The woman looking back at me had more wrinkles than I remembered. Her shoulders were slightly smaller. Her hair carried far more silver. But her eyes, they were still the same eyes that had watched a little boy take his first steps across this very living room. Still the same eyes that had watched her husband close his forever. Still the same eyes that refused to hate. I whispered, "You can do this." Before leaving, I walked upstairs one last time. The wooden box waited on my bed. Today was the day. David's instructions had been simple. When Michael gets married, no matter what happened at the church, the box belonged there. I wrapped it carefully inside the same cream-colored towel that had protected it for years, then placed everything inside a leather tote bag. It felt surprisingly heavy, not because of its weight, because of what it represented. The drive to Columbus took just under 40 minutes. Every mile carried another memory. Michael's first driving lesson, family trips to the zoo, college move-in day, the hospital where David died, the church where the wedding would take place stood only a few streets away from the cemetery where he was buried. That coincidence had never occurred to me until that morning. As I stopped at a red light, I glanced toward the cemetery entrance in the distance. Without thinking, I turned the car. 5 minutes later, I stood before David's headstone. Fresh grass surrounded the marker. Someone had placed small white flowers nearby. Probably the church volunteers. I knelt slowly. "I wish you were here." Wind stirred through the trees. "I don't know what's going to happen today." Silence answered. "I've tried to do everything right." A tear slid down my cheek. "I tried to keep our family together." More silence. "I hope," my voice trembled, "I hope I don't disappoint you." For several moments, I simply rested my fingertips against the cool granite. Then I stood. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Tucked beneath a small stone beside David's grave was a folded piece of paper. At first, I assumed it had blown there with the wind, but when I picked it up, I recognized the handwriting instantly. It wasn't David's. It was Michael's, and at the top of the page, written in blue ink, were 7 words that made my heart begin to pound. "Dad, I don't know what to do." My hands trembled as I unfolded the note. The paper was slightly damp from the morning dew, but the handwriting was unmistakably Michael's. He still wrote the way he had in high school, pressing the pen so firmly that the letters left faint impressions on the back of the page. For a moment, I wondered if I should read it at all. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to David. Then I remembered that David wasn't here anymore. Only I was. I looked around the quiet cemetery. The only sounds were birds settling in the trees and the distant hum of traffic beyond the stone wall. Finally, I began reading. "Dad, I don't know what to do. I wish you were here because Mom listens with her heart, but you always knew how to make sense of things." My chest tightened. Everyone keeps telling me this wedding is supposed to be the happiest day of my life, but it feels like I'm trying to make everyone happy, except myself. I stopped breathing for a second. So he wasn't blind. He knew. Olivia says this is only one day, and sometimes compromises have to be made for marriage. Richard keeps reminding me how much their family has invested in the wedding. Susan says appearances matter more than people realize. The next sentence hurt more than I expected. Mom would probably tell me to do what feels right. A tear landed on the page. He still knew me, even now. He knew exactly what I would have said. Then why wasn't he listening? I continued. The problem is that what feels right seems to disappoint someone no matter what I choose. The letter ended abruptly. I hope I'm making the right decision. Love, Michael. There was no date, no signature beyond his first name, no answer. Only a son speaking to the father he still missed. I folded the note carefully and looked at David's headstone. So he came to you, I whispered. Not to me, to his father. Maybe because he already knew what I would say, or maybe because he couldn't bear seeing disappointment in my eyes. I slipped the letter into my purse. One day, if Michael wanted it back, I would give it to him. For now, it felt like something entrusted to both of us. I'll take care of him, I told David softly, as long as he'll let me. I placed my hand against the cool granite one last time before walking back toward my car. The church was less than 10 minutes away. With every mile, I tried to steady my breathing. Whatever happened today, I wanted to face it with dignity. Not because anyone else deserved it. Because David had. Because Michael once had. Because I still deserve to recognize myself when I looked in the mirror tomorrow. The church parking lot was already filling when I arrived. Elegant sedans, luxury SUVs, fresh flowers tied to signposts. Guests dressed in pastel colors walked toward the entrance laughing quietly. No one noticed me. I was grateful for that. I reached into the passenger seat and picked up my leather tote. Inside, wrapped securely in the cream-colored towel, rested David's wooden box. I checked it once more before closing the bag. Still there, still waiting. As I stepped out of the car, I heard someone call my name. Eren. I turned. It was Linda Harper. She and I had worked together at the Columbus Public Library for nearly 15 years before she retired. "Oh my goodness," she said, smiling warmly. "You look beautiful." "So do you." She hugged me tightly. "I almost didn't recognize you in that dress." I laughed. Michael picked it years ago. Her smile softened. He always was thoughtful. The word lingered between us. Was. She glanced toward the church. "Are you excited?" "I've been excited for months." She studied my face carefully. "Something's wrong." I tried to smile. "It's just emotional." Linda had known me too long to believe easy answers. "If you need anything today," she squeezed my hand. "I'm here." I nodded gratefully. "I know." We walked toward the entrance together. Inside, volunteers greeted arriving guests with printed programs. Soft piano music floated through the sanctuary. White roses lined the aisles. Sunlight poured through stained glass windows, scattering blues and reds across the polished wooden pews. It was beautiful. Exactly the kind of wedding David would have loved. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to imagine a different version of this day. David sitting beside me, Michael smiling at us both. No tension, no silence, just family. Reality returned quickly. A young usher approached us carrying a seating chart. "Good morning," he smiled politely. "May I help you find your seats?" Linda gave her name first. He located it immediately. Then he looked at me. "And your name, ma'am?" "Eren Ozmen." His finger moved down the page, then stopped. A tiny crease appeared between his eyebrows. He checked another page, then another. "I'm sorry." He looked confused. "Would you mind waiting just a moment?" "Of course." He disappeared toward the front of the church. Linda frowned. "What's going on?" "I don't know." Although, deep inside, I think I already did. A minute later, he returned with another coordinator, a woman wearing a headset and carrying a clipboard. She smiled professionally. "Mrs. Ozmen?" "Yes." "I'm so sorry." She lowered her voice. "There was a small seating adjustment." Of course there was. She pointed discreetly toward the back of the sanctuary. "We've reserved a comfortable seat for you there." I followed her gesture. The last row, almost against the wall. far enough away that facial expressions at the altar would be difficult to see, far enough away that photographs certainly wouldn't include me. I looked toward the front. The first pew on the groom's side held a white ribbon across the center. A small card rested on the seat. Even from a distance I could read the words, "Mother of the Groom." Someone was already sitting there, Susan Bennett. She wore a pale silver dress and a satisfied smile while chatting with arriving guests. She looked perfect. Exactly the image Olivia had wanted. The coordinator continued speaking. "I hope this arrangement is acceptable." Acceptable. I almost laughed. Instead, I asked quietly, "Who made the change?" She hesitated. "I'm not really at liberty. I won't argue." She looked relieved. "I simply want to know." After a long pause, she answered honestly. "The bride provided the final seating chart. Not Michael. Olivia. Although Michael had signed off on it. He had to have." I nodded once. "Thank you." The coordinator hurried away. Linda looked furious. "Eren, it's all right." "No." She stared toward the front pew. "It isn't." Several guests nearby had begun noticing. I heard whispers. "Isn't that Michael's mother? I thought she'd be up front. What happened?" Someone else glanced toward Susan. "Oh." The understanding spread quietly from row to row. Embarrassment flushed my cheeks. Not because I had done anything wrong, because everyone else now knew it too. Linda leaned closer. "Come sit with me." I smiled gratefully. "I'd like that." As we started toward the back, another voice called across the sanctuary. "Eren!" I turned again. Pastor Samuel Brooks was walking down the center aisle carrying a folder. He looked older than I remembered, but his eyes were sharp. For a second he simply stared at me. Then genuine surprise crossed his face. "Eren Ozmen." "It's been a long time." He smiled warmly. "It certainly has." He glanced toward the front pew, then back at me. A puzzled expression replaced his smile. "I thought—" He stopped himself. "You thought what?" I asked. He looked around before lowering his voice. "I was told the groom's mother had already arrived." I followed his gaze toward Susan, then back to him. "I have." His eyes narrowed ever so slightly. He looked from me to Susan, and then toward the folder in his hands. Something didn't seem to fit. "I see." But judging by his expression, he most certainly did not. Without another word, Pastor Samuel excused himself and walked briskly toward the small office beside the altar. As the door closed behind him, I noticed him opening the wedding file, turning pages, stopping, reading something again. A strange feeling settled over me. Not hope, not yet. Just the unmistakable sense that somewhere inside those documents, something wasn't matching. And for the very first time that morning, I realized I might not be the only person who believed something was terribly wrong. I tried to focus on the music. The pianist had begun playing a gentle arrangement of Canon in D, and guests gradually settled into their seats as the sanctuary filled with quiet conversations and the rustle of elegant clothing. But my attention kept drifting toward the front row, toward Susan. She looked perfectly comfortable sitting in the seat that should have belonged to me. People stopped to greet her. Some assumed she was Michael's mother. Others clearly knew she wasn't, but smiled politely anyway, choosing comfort over truth. I couldn't blame them. Most people avoid awkward moments whenever they can. I used to do the same. Linda leaned closer and whispered, "Do you want me to say something?" I shook my head. "No. This isn't right." "I know. We can talk to someone. And tell them that they're humiliating you." I smiled faintly. "They already know." Her eyes filled with sympathy. "I hate this." "So do I." For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Instead, we watched guests arrive one after another. Some recognized me immediately. Others glanced from me to Susan with confused expressions before quietly taking their seats. An older gentleman I vaguely remembered from Michael's engineering firm approached the front pew. He shook Susan's hand warmly. "It's wonderful finally meeting Michael's mother." Susan hesitated only briefly. Then she smiled. "It's lovely to meet you, too." She never corrected him. Not once. The words echoed inside my head. She never corrected him. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had exhausted itself. What remained was something far sadder. The realization that someone else was willing to wear my place as though it fit. The church doors opened again. Michael stepped inside. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, and for one breathtaking moment, all I could see was David. The same height, the same shoulders, the same way his tie always sat, just slightly crooked until someone fixed it. He looked handsome, nervous, older than I remembered. He laughed at something one of his groomsmen said, but the smile faded almost instantly. His eyes scanned the sanctuary, first the left side, then the right, then the back, until they found me. Time seemed to stop. Across the crowded church, mother and son looked at each other without moving. His smile disappeared completely. I couldn't read everything in his expression, but I recognized guilt. He knew. He had known exactly where they seated me. For a brief second, I thought he might walk toward me. Instead, Olivia's wedding planner appeared beside him and handed him a clipboard. She spoke quietly. Michael glanced at me one last time, then lowered his eyes. He turned away. Linda muttered under her breath, "He should come here." I didn't answer, because I had wanted the same thing. Not a grand apology, not an announcement, just for my son to walk 20 steps across the church and sit beside me for 1 minute. 20 steps. They might as well have been 20 miles. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in 15 minutes. Groomsmen lined up near the side entrance. Bridesmaids gathered in another room. Guests silenced their phones. The sanctuary gradually became still. I watched Michael greeting relatives from Olivia's side. He smiled, shook hands, accepted hugs. Every movement looked practiced, automatic. Then something unexpected happened. He excused himself, alone, without speaking to anyone. He walked quickly down a side hallway leading toward the small prayer chapel attached to the church. Almost instinctively, I stood. "Where are you going?" Linda whispered. "I'll be right back." I followed at a respectful distance. The hallway was empty. At the far end, I saw Michael enter the tiny chapel. The door remained slightly open. I hesitated. I wasn't planning to interrupt. I wasn't even sure what I wanted. Closure? Maybe. Or one honest conversation before everything became permanent. As I approached, I heard his voice, soft, shaking. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing." He wasn't talking to anyone. He was praying. "I've gone too far to change everything now." Silence. Then another sentence. "I just need today to be over." My heart broke all over again, because those weren't the words of a happy groom. Those were the words of a frightened man. I almost stepped inside. Almost. Then another voice entered the chapel. "Olivia." "There you are." Michael turned quickly. "I just needed a minute." She smiled, though there was tension behind it. "The photographer is waiting." "I know." She noticed his expression immediately. "You're thinking about your mother again." He looked away. Olivia sighed. "We've already discussed this." "I know." "You agreed." "I know." "You can't start questioning everything now." Michael rubbed his forehead. What?" "I hate how she looked when she walked in." Olivia folded her arms. "Michael?" "No." He looked directly at her. "I saw her." "So did I." "She looked—" He couldn't finish. Olivia's voice became firmer. "This is one day." "I know." "One day." "I know." "Our marriage lasts forever." Silence. "My parents have spent nearly $100,000 making today happen." I froze. $100,000. "I understand." "Do you—" She stepped closer. "Because right now it feels like you're choosing guilt over us." "I'm not." "Then prove it." Another long silence. Finally, Michael nodded. "Okay." That single word felt heavier than anything else I'd heard all morning. He wasn't agreeing because he believed it. He was surrendering. Olivia smiled with relief. She straightened his tie, brushed invisible lint from his jacket, then kissed his cheek. "Everything will be perfect." She took his hand. As they walked toward the door, I stepped quietly back into the hallway before they could see me. My legs suddenly felt weak. I leaned against the wall until they passed. Neither of them noticed me. When I returned to the sanctuary, Linda looked concerned. "You were gone a while." "I know." "Everything okay?" I sat slowly. "No." I didn't tell her what I'd heard. Not because I wanted to protect Olivia, because I wanted to protect Michael. Even now, even after everything. A mother never completely stops shielding her child, even from the consequences of his own choices. Guests rose as the first notes of the processional began. The officiant and groomsmen took their places. Michael walked to the front of the church. He stood beneath the flowers with his hands clasped tightly together. His face was pale. Pastor Samuel joined him at the altar. As the pastor quietly arranged his notes, I noticed him glance toward me again. Not casually, deliberately. Then he opened the leather ceremony folder. Instead of beginning immediately, he frowned, turned another page, stopped, read something twice, closed the folder, opened it again. His expression changed. Not confusion, recognition. He looked toward the first pew. Susan smiled politely back at him. Then he looked toward me. His eyes lingered, almost as if comparing two photographs. A church coordinator approached him and whispered something. Pastor Samuel nodded absent-mindedly without taking his eyes off me. Something was bothering him. I could see it. The music changed. The bridesmaids entered one by one. Beautiful dresses, careful smiles. Guests stood to watch. Then came the flower girl, then the ring bearer. Everything unfolded exactly as rehearsed, except for one person. Pastor Samuel wasn't watching the aisle. He was studying the folder again, almost searching for something or someone. As Olivia appeared at the entrance on Richard Bennett's arm, every guest rose to their feet. The sanctuary fell completely silent. She looked radiant. Her gown shimmered softly beneath the stained glass light. Richard walked proudly beside her. Michael smiled, or at least tried to. Pastor Samuel closed the folder, took a slow breath, then looked directly at me. Not once, twice, 3 times. The ceremony finally began. "Dearly beloved." His voice echoed through the sanctuary. He welcomed everyone, spoke about love, commitment, family. Then just as he reached for the marriage documents, he stopped speaking. The silence was so sudden that every head in the church lifted. Pastor Samuel stared at one page, blinking, reading it again. His brows slowly drew together. He looked first at Michael, then at Olivia, then toward the front pew. Finally, his eyes found mine. And for the second time that morning, I saw unmistakable recognition spread across his face. Very calmly, he closed the folder, looked across the silent sanctuary, and said, "I'm sorry." Another pause. "Before we continue," he looked directly at me. "There is one question that must be answered." The entire church turned toward the last row where I was sitting, and I suddenly realized this wedding was no longer unfolding according to Olivia Bennett's perfect plan. For several long seconds, no one moved. The only sound inside the sanctuary was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant cry of a baby somewhere in the back of the church. Every face turned toward me. I felt hundreds of eyes settle on my shoulders at once. My first instinct was to disappear. Instead, I straightened my back. Pastor Samuel rested one hand on the leather folder lying open on the lectern. "I apologize for the interruption," he said calmly. "But before I can continue this ceremony, I need to verify something." Olivia's smile froze. Richard Bennett frowned. Susan shifted uncomfortably in the front pew. Michael looked as though all the color had drained from his face. Olivia laughed softly, trying to ease the tension. "I'm sure whatever it is can wait until after the ceremony." Pastor Samuel smiled politely. "I'm afraid it cannot." The church became even quieter. He looked back down at the documents. "When I prepare a wedding ceremony, I always review the legal paperwork alongside the family information submitted by the couple." He tapped the folder lightly. "There appears to be an inconsistency." Richard stood halfway. "What kind of inconsistency? Nothing criminal?" Pastor Samuel remained composed. "But it is significant enough that I cannot ignore it." Olivia reached for Michael's hand. "What exactly is the problem?" "The problem," Pastor Samuel replied, "concerns the family declaration attached to the ceremony." Richard spoke with the confidence of a businessman used to solving problems with authority. "I'm sure it's simply an administrative mistake." "I hoped so." Pastor Samuel nodded. "Unfortunately, after comparing the submitted documents with the records already held by this church," he paused, "I realized they do not match." A murmur spread through the guests. I stared at the pastor, confused. Church records. How could they possibly have anything about Michael? "Pastor." Samuel looked toward me again. Recognition softened his expression. Then memory flashed across his face. Of course, he had known David. Years ago, long before Michael was born. Our family had attended this very church until David's engineering job transferred us to another part of Columbus. Pastor Samuel had baptized Michael. He had blessed our 25th wedding anniversary. He had preached David's funeral. He remembered. He remembered all of us. Olivia spoke again, this time with obvious impatience. "Pastor Brooks, perhaps we can sign whatever needs correcting afterward." "I wish it were that simple." He lifted a single sheet of paper. "The family declaration submitted for today's ceremony identifies the primary maternal representative participating in the blessing." Susan smiled politely, believing the explanation supported her. Pastor Samuel continued, "But that declaration conflicts with the historical family records maintained by this church." Richard sighed dramatically. "Surely church records from decades ago aren't relevant." Pastor Samuel's eyes never left the page. "They become relevant when the couple specifically requests a family blessing based upon those records." Olivia's expression changed, just slightly, enough that I noticed. She hadn't expected that. Neither had Richard. Michael looked between them in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Pastor Samuel turned the folder so Michael could see. "When your wedding coordinator met with me 6 months ago, she selected the traditional family covenant ceremony." Michael frowned. "I don't remember that." "I imagine many details were handled by others." He spoke without accusation. "But that particular ceremony includes a declaration acknowledging the parents whose guidance brought the bride and groom to this altar." My heart began beating faster. I remembered that tradition. David and I had chosen it at our own wedding. It wasn't legally required, but if you chose it, the officiant publicly recognized the parents before continuing. Olivia swallowed. "We made a few adjustments." Pastor Samuel nodded. "So I noticed." He carefully removed another document. "This version lists Mrs. Susan Bennett in the place normally reserved for the groom's mother." The whispering throughout the sanctuary grew louder. Susan finally stood. "There is nothing improper about honoring someone who has become family." "No," Pastor Samuel agreed calmly. "There isn't." He closed the folder halfway. "But there is something improper about altering a declaration in a way that contradicts the information upon which the ceremony itself is based." Richard stepped forward. "This is becoming unnecessary." Pastor Samuel met his eyes. "I disagree." His voice remained gentle. "But I also have a responsibility." Michael finally spoke. "I don't understand." Pastor Samuel turned toward him. "Michael." His tone softened. "When I baptized you in this church 35 years ago." Michael stared. "Your father asked me for one promise." I felt the air leave my lungs. David Richard looked irritated. "What does that have to do with today?" Pastor Samuel answered without taking his eyes off Michael. "He asked that if I were ever blessed enough to officiate his son's wedding." He smiled sadly. "I would honor the people who sacrificed to bring that young man to this moment." The sanctuary fell completely silent. Michael's eyes widened. "I never knew that." "You were a baby." Pastor Samuel nodded. "Your father couldn't have known whether he would still be alive when you married." My throat tightened. Neither could I. But he wanted one thing to remain true. The pastor looked slowly across the room. "Truth." Olivia squeezed Michael's arm. "We don't need to do this." Pastor Samuel raised one hand politely. "I'm almost finished." Then he asked the question, not loudly, not dramatically, simply, clearly. "Who can tell me the exact words David Ozmen asked me to speak before blessing his son's marriage?" Nobody answered. Richard looked confused. Susan looked equally lost. Olivia blinked. Michael lowered his head. The silence stretched. 1 second, 5, 10. Pastor Samuel looked around the sanctuary once. Then his eyes settled on me. "I believe," he said quietly. "There is only one person here who knows." My hands were trembling, because I did know, not from guessing, not from memory alone. David and I had written those words together in this very church one autumn evening after Michael's baptism. We had laughed because David insisted promises should be simple enough for children to remember. I hadn't thought about that conversation in more than 30 years. Yet every word returned as though no time had passed. Pastor Samuel smiled gently. "Mrs. Ozmen." The title caught me by surprise. Not Eren, not ma'am. Mrs. Ozmen, David's wife, Michael's mother. "Would you please come forward?" I looked down at my leather tote resting beside my feet. Inside it, wrapped carefully in the cream-colored towel, was David's wooden box. Without fully understanding why, I picked it up before standing. Every guest watched as I slowly walked down the center aisle. No one spoke. When I reached the altar, Michael looked at me with eyes full of regret. He opened his mouth. "I'm sorry, Mom." I placed one gentle hand over his. "Not now." My voice was barely above a whisper. "There will be time later." Pastor Samuel stepped aside, giving me room beside my son. For the first time that day, I was standing where I had always belonged. He looked at me kindly. "Mrs. Ozmen." I nodded. Then, with tears gathering in my eyes, I repeated the words David had written more than 3 decades earlier. "A marriage cannot be blessed by pretending someone else's sacrifice built it. Before God, we honor the hands that carried this family here because gratitude is the strongest foundation any home will ever have." The sanctuary became utterly still. Several guests wiped away tears. Linda covered her mouth. Michael closed his eyes. Olivia slowly released his hand. Pastor Samuel smiled sadly. "I was hoping someone would still remember." Then he looked down at the wooden box I was holding. His expression changed. He stared at it for several seconds before whispering, "David actually kept it." I frowned. "You know about this?" He nodded slowly. "I helped him prepare it." My heart skipped. Everything I thought I knew about the wooden box suddenly changed. And for the first time in 18 years, I realized Pastor Samuel knew exactly what was inside. For a moment I forgot there were more than 100 people watching us. The church, the wedding, the whispers. Everything around me seemed to disappear. I looked down at the walnut box in my hands, then back at Pastor Samuel. "You helped David prepare this." He nodded slowly. "I did." My fingers tightened around the brass latch. "You knew what he put inside." "I knew some of it." He smiled gently, "but not all of it." Michael looked between us, completely bewildered. "What is everyone talking about?" Pastor Samuel turned toward him. "Your father visited me 3 times during the final months of his illness." Michael stared. "He never told me." "He didn't want you to know." "Why?" "Because he wanted you to grow into your own man, not spend your life preparing for the possibility of losing him." I felt tears sting my eyes. That sounded exactly like David, always thinking about someone else's heart before his own. Olivia stepped forward, forcing a polite smile. "Pastor Brooks, with all due respect, perhaps this conversation would be better after the ceremony." Richard immediately agreed. "Exactly. The guests don't need to witness a family discussion." Pastor Samuel remained calm. "I agree." Relief flashed across Olivia's face. "But," he continued, "I cannot continue until one matter is resolved." Her smile disappeared. He picked up the ceremony folder once more. "When a couple chooses the family covenant blessing, they are making a public declaration." He looked directly at Michael. "Not merely a symbolic one." Michael frowned. "I honestly didn't understand that." "I believe you." Pastor Samuel's voice carried kindness rather than accusation. Which is why I would like to ask one question. He held up the declaration. Michael? Yes. When this document was presented to you, did you personally request that your mother's name be removed? The sanctuary became perfectly silent. Michael looked at the paper, then at Olivia, then at Susan. His breathing became noticeably heavier. He stopped. Pastor Samuel waited patiently. There is no rush. Michael swallowed. I signed a lot of documents. I understand. I trusted that everything had already been prepared. Pastor Samuel nodded. So you did not specifically request this change? Michael slowly shook his head. No. Richard immediately stepped forward. That's enough. His voice carried authority. This is becoming an interrogation. Pastor Samuel looked at him respectfully. No, Mr. Bennett. It is becoming clarity. Richard folded his arms. The outcome is the same. I disagree. Pastor Samuel turned another page. Because this change required an additional authorization. Olivia's face went pale, very pale. He continued. The original declaration listed Mrs. Eren Ozmen. He held up another sheet. The revised declaration lists Mrs. Susan Bennett. He placed both papers side by side. The handwriting on the amendment belongs neither to Michael Carter. His eyes slowly lifted. Nor to me. No one spoke. Olivia looked toward the floor. Susan gripped the front pew tightly. Richard's jaw clenched. Pastor Samuel didn't accuse anyone. He simply asked, would whoever submitted this amendment care to explain why it was made? Another long silence. Finally, Olivia stepped forward. I requested it. Her voice barely carried across the church. Richard closed his eyes. Susan reached for her daughter's arm, but Olivia gently pulled away. Yes. She looked directly at Pastor Samuel. I changed it. Michael turned toward her. You... what? She avoided his eyes. I thought it would simplify everything. Michael stared. You told me they only adjusted seating. She hesitated. I didn't think this part mattered. Pastor Samuel asked quietly, if it didn't matter, why change it? Olivia couldn't answer immediately. Everyone waited. Finally, she whispered, my mother has been involved in every part of this wedding. Pastor Samuel remained silent. I thought... She looked toward Susan. It would look more natural. Michael's expression changed. What do you mean by natural? Olivia looked helplessly between everyone. You just what? Michael asked again. I didn't want people asking questions. What questions? She took a shaky breath. Questions about why... Her voice nearly disappeared. Why our families seemed so different. I closed my eyes. There it was. Finally, the truth. Not tradition, not logistics, not convenience, appearance, image, presentation, everything I had suspected. Only now everyone else heard it too. Michael stared at her as though seeing her for the first time. You embarrassed my mother. 'Cause you were worried about photographs. Olivia immediately shook her head. No, it wasn't only that. Then tell me. My parents, she looked toward Richard, thought guests might assume... Again, she couldn't finish. Richard interrupted. Olivia. No, she finally looked at Michael. I'll say it. Tears filled her eyes. My parents believed the wedding would appear more elegant if your mother wasn't the public focus. The words echoed through the sanctuary. No one moved. Even the pianist had stopped breathing loudly enough to be heard. Michael slowly turned toward the first pew. Susan looked away, then toward Richard. Richard refused to meet his eyes. Finally, he looked at me. I didn't cry, I didn't glare. I simply stood there, holding David's wooden box against my chest. Michael whispered, Mom. I smiled sadly. I know. You knew. I suspected. His face crumpled. I know. I never wanted this. I believe you. Those 4 words seemed to hurt him more than any accusation could have. Because belief carries responsibility. He could no longer hide behind misunderstanding. He had allowed it to happen. even if he hadn't planned it, even if he hadn't written the words. He had stayed silent. Pastor Samuel quietly closed the folder. I think everyone now understands how we arrived here. No one argued. He turned toward me. Mrs. Ozmen. His eyes dropped to the walnut box. May I ask? Did David ever tell you to open it before today? I shook my head. Never. And have you? No. He nodded slowly. Then today is the first day. Michael frowned. What box? I looked down at it. The last gift your father ever gave us. His eyes widened. There was something for me. There always was. He looked stunned. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because your father asked us not to. Pastor Samuel smiled gently. He believed some lessons only become meaningful at the right moment. Michael stared at the box as though seeing a part of his father for the first time in 18 years. I want to know what's inside. I know. I looked at the brass latch. So many years, so many unanswered questions. I slowly placed my thumb against the clasp. Every person inside the sanctuary watched. The small piece of brass felt cool beneath my fingers. I took one slow breath, then another. Finally, with a soft metallic click, the latch released. For the first time since David had closed it with his own hands, the wooden box was open. The tiny brass latch clicked so softly that under ordinary circumstances no one would have noticed it. But inside that silent church, the sound seemed to echo through every pew. I slowly lifted the lid. The scent of old cedar drifted upward. For 18 years, whatever David had placed inside had remained untouched, exactly as he had left it. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to look. My hands were trembling too much. Pastor Samuel stood quietly beside me, saying nothing. He understood that this wasn't simply opening a box. It was opening the final conversation my husband had never lived long enough to finish. I finally looked inside. There wasn't money. There wasn't jewelry. There wasn't a will. Instead, everything had been arranged with extraordinary care. A neatly folded, handwritten letter rested on top. Beneath it lay a worn leather wallet, several old photographs tied together with a blue ribbon, a small velvet pouch, and at the very bottom a sealed envelope with one sentence written across the front in David's unmistakable handwriting. Only if my son forgets what family means. My heart ached. Pastor Samuel closed his eyes briefly. He really did it, he whispered. Michael stared at the contents. I've never seen any of this. You weren't supposed to, I answered softly. Not until today. Olivia remained perfectly still. Richard and Susan exchanged anxious glances, but wisely stayed silent. This moment no longer belonged to them. It belonged to David. I picked up the handwritten letter first. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but David's handwriting remained bold and steady. I recognized every curve of every letter. He had written my grocery lists, birthday cards, notes tucked into my lunch when we were newly married. Seeing his handwriting again felt like hearing his voice. I looked toward Michael. This is for you. His eyes were already wet. You should read it. I gently shook my head. Your father asked me to give it to you. Michael reached out hesitantly, then stopped. No. He looked at me. I want you to read it. I swallowed hard. Are you sure? He nodded. I think Dad expected your voice. Pastor Samuel smiled sadly. I believe he did. My vision blurred with tears as I unfolded the letter. The sanctuary became so quiet that I could hear paper moving between my fingers. I began reading. My dear Michael, if you're reading this, it means your wedding day has finally arrived. First, let me tell you what I wish I could have said standing beside you. I am proud of you, not because of your career, not because of the home you've built, not because of the success you may achieve. I am proud because from the day I first held you, you taught me how much one human heart can love another. If I am no longer with you, do not waste your life grieving the years we missed. Spend it honoring the people who stayed, especially your mother. I stopped reading for a moment. The words blurred completely. Michael covered his mouth. Across the room, several guests quietly wiped away tears. I continued, There will come a day when people admire your accomplishments. They will congratulate you, respect you, perhaps even envy you. Remember this: none of those people sat beside your bed when you were sick. None of them skipped meals so you could eat. None of them worked until midnight to keep a roof over your head. One person did, your mother. If you ever reach a moment where the world asks you to choose between appearances and gratitude, choose gratitude, because appearances disappear. Character remains. Michael closed his eyes. A single tear rolled down his cheek. I continued reading, though my own voice had become unsteady. Marriage is not the joining of two perfect families. It is the joining of two imperfect people who decide love matters more than pride. The woman you marry deserves your loyalty, but never mistake loyalty for abandoning the people who taught you how to love in the first place. No wife should ask you to forget your mother. No mother should ask you to choose between them. If either happens, something has already gone wrong. The church remained silent. Even Olivia wasn't looking at anyone anymore. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor. Richard slowly removed his glasses. Susan quietly folded her hands together. Nobody interrupted. Nobody could. David's words had reached every corner of the sanctuary. I read the final paragraphs. There is one last thing. If your mother is reading this letter aloud instead of placing it quietly into your hands, then something has happened that broke her heart. If that is true, son, stop. Look at her. Really look at her. Before you say another word, ask yourself one question. Has anyone in this room loved me longer? If the answer is no, then remember who carried you here. With all my love, Dad, David Ozmen. When I finished, I lowered the letter. The silence that followed felt sacred. No applause, no whispers, only quiet. Michael stood perfectly still. Then very slowly he turned toward me. His face was streaked with tears. I'm so sorry. The words barely escaped his lips. I'm so sorry. I wanted to say everything at once. How much he'd hurt me. How lonely I'd been. How many nights I'd cried after our conversations. Instead, I simply reached up and touched his face. The way I had when he was 5 years old after scraping his knee. The way I had when he was 16 after losing his father. My sweet boy, I whispered. He broke. Not emotionally, completely. He stepped forward and wrapped both arms around me, the same way he used to after nightmares, the same way he hugged me on his high school graduation day. I'm sorry, he repeated against my shoulder. I should have seen it. I should have stopped it. I failed you. I held him tightly. You made a terrible mistake. He nodded against my shoulder. I know. But mistakes can still be confessed. His shoulders shook. I don't know how to fix this. Before I could answer, another voice interrupted. I do. Everyone turned. It was Olivia. She had stepped away from the altar. Her veil caught the light as she walked slowly toward us. She wasn't crying dramatically. She looked defeated. She stopped a few feet away. I owe Mrs. Ozmen an apology. She looked directly at me for the first time that day. A real one. I waited. I convinced myself I was protecting the wedding. Her voice trembled. But really, she glanced around the church. I was protecting my own image. She swallowed. I told myself appearances didn't matter. A sad smile crossed her face. And then I spent months proving that they did. She looked at Michael. I asked you to compromise. Then at me. But what I was really asking... Her eyes filled with tears. It was for a mother to disappear so my wedding photographs would look perfect. She lowered her head. I am deeply ashamed of that. No one spoke. Finally, Richard Bennett stood. He walked slowly down the aisle until he reached his daughter. Without looking at anyone else, he said quietly, Olivia. She looked up. We raised you to succeed. He paused. Somewhere along the way, his voice cracked. We forgot to teach you that kindness is worth more than perfection. Susan began crying silently. For the first time since I had met them, neither of them looked wealthy. Neither looked powerful. They simply looked like parents realizing they had failed their child in ways money could never repair. Pastor Samuel quietly closed the ceremony folder. Then he looked at me. There is still one unopened envelope in the box. I looked down. He was right. The sealed envelope remained exactly where David had left it. Across the front, his handwriting seemed almost alive. Only if my son forgets what family means. Pastor Samuel met my eyes. Eren, I believe it's time to decide whether that envelope still needs to be opened. I rested my hand gently on it. Then I looked at Michael. His eyes were red, his shoulders still shaking. He hadn't let go of my hand. For the first time all day, I wasn't sure David's final secret needed to be revealed at all. My fingers rested lightly on the sealed envelope. For 18 years, I had imagined this moment in 100 different ways. Sometimes I pictured opening it in the quiet of my living room after a joyful wedding reception with Michael laughing beside me and grandchildren running through the yard years later. Other times, usually on lonely nights, I imagined never opening it at all. Perhaps David had only wanted me to know it was there. Perhaps it was simply another reminder that love sometimes prepares for storms long before the clouds appear. Now the storm had come. And yet, standing beside my son, while he still clung to my hand, I wasn't certain the envelope belonged to this moment anymore. Pastor Samuel waited patiently. "So?" he asked softly. I looked at Michael. His eyes were swollen from crying. His tuxedo was wrinkled where he had buried his face against my shoulder. He looked nothing like the confident engineer who had walked into the sanctuary earlier that morning. He looked like the 16-year-old boy who had stood beside me after David's funeral, asking how we were supposed to survive. "I don't know," I admitted. Pastor Samuel nodded. "You don't have to decide immediately." Michael looked at the envelope. "What is it?" "I honestly don't know," I answered. "You've never opened it." "Never." He frowned. "You kept that promise all these years. I promised your father." He lowered his head. "And I couldn't even keep faith with you for one wedding." The shame in his voice cut deeper than any anger could have. I squeezed his hand gently. "Michael?" "No." He shook his head. "I need to say this." He turned to face the guests. Every chair was occupied. Every eye remained fixed on him. He took a slow breath. "When my father died," his voice trembled, "I thought I understood what my mother had lost." He glanced at me. "I didn't." Another pause. "I only understood what I had lost." Several people nodded quietly. "I grew up believing my mother was strong because she never complained." He laughed bitterly. "I never realized she stayed quiet because she was protecting me." He swallowed. "Somewhere along the way, I started confusing peace with silence." His words echoed through the sanctuary. "I kept telling Mom not to make things difficult." He looked at me with tears filling his eyes again. "But she wasn't the one making them difficult." He slowly turned toward Olivia. I was. Olivia stood motionless. I asked my mother to stay quiet. I asked her to understand. I asked her to sacrifice one more time. He closed his eyes briefly. And she did. He looked around the church. Because that's what she's done my entire life. The room remained silent, except for quiet sniffles from somewhere behind us. Michael continued. "I told myself I was protecting my future." His shoulders sagged. But all I was really protecting was my own comfort. Richard Bennett lowered his eyes. Susan reached for a tissue. Linda Harper smiled sadly from the last row. No one interrupted. There was nothing to interrupt. The truth was finally speaking for itself. Michael turned back toward me. "I don't deserve your forgiveness today," I answered honestly. "No." His eyes filled again. "But forgiveness isn't something people deserve." I smiled gently. "It's something they choose." He looked at me in disbelief. "After everything?" I didn't say I'd forgotten. A few guests smiled softly. But I refused to lose my son on the same day I almost lost my place in his life. He wrapped his arms around me again. This hug felt different. Not desperate, not guilty, simply grateful. When we stepped apart, Pastor Samuel spoke. "Eren." "Yes. I think David trusted your judgment more than anyone else's." I looked down at the envelope again. "So, if you believe it shouldn't be opened, then perhaps that is your answer." Michael frowned. "But Dad wrote." "I know what he wrote." I traced the words with my thumb. Only if my son forgets what family means. I looked directly into Michael's eyes. Tell me something. Anything. Right now. Have you remembered? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the sanctuary. At me, at the letter from his father, at the empty distance between the first pew and the last row where I had been sitting only minutes earlier. Finally, he whispered, "Yes." I smiled. "I believe you." Then, without another word, I lifted the sealed envelope. Every guest leaned forward. Slowly, I placed it back inside the walnut box, without opening it. The sanctuary seemed to exhale all at once. Michael blinked. "You're not going to read it?" I shook my head. "No." "But Dad, your father gave me instructions." I smiled softly. "And he also trusted me." Pastor Samuel nodded with quiet approval. "I think David would understand." Michael looked confused. "But what if there's something important inside?" I gently closed the lid of the box. "If there is, it has already done its job." He stared at me. "I don't understand." I rested one hand against the polished walnut. "That envelope was meant for the day you forgot." I reached up and touched his cheek. "You remembered." His eyes widened slowly. "So I don't need what's inside anymore." Tears spilled down his face again. "Oh, Mom." I hugged him once more. Behind us, someone quietly began clapping. One pair of hands, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire church filled with applause. Not loud, not celebratory. Respectful, warm. It wasn't applause for me, or even for Michael. It was applause for Grace. When the room finally became quiet again, Olivia stepped closer. She looked at the wooden box. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." If Michael had never apologized, she hesitated. "Would you have opened it?" I answered truthfully. "Yes." She nodded slowly. "So whatever is inside could have changed everything." "It probably could have." Richard spoke for the first time in several minutes. "I think..." His voice sounded older somehow. "I owe you an apology, too." I looked at him. "I spent my entire career measuring people by accomplishments." He sighed. "I forgot that character isn't something money can purchase." Susan walked over quietly. Her eyes were red. "Eren," she hesitated. "I accepted that front row seat." I nodded. "I know. I should have refused." "Yes." I was flattered. She wiped another tear away. "And I never stopped to ask what accepting it would cost you." For the first time since we'd met, her apology sounded completely genuine. I smiled gently. "I appreciate you saying that." She lowered her head. "I don't expect forgiveness." "I appreciate honesty." Pastor Samuel glanced toward the guests. "I believe everyone here has witnessed something far more important than a wedding." Several people nodded. He smiled. "But there is still one question." Everyone looked at him. He turned toward Michael. "My son." He chuckled softly. "I've known you since you were baptized." Michael smiled through his tears. "I know. So I'll ask plainly." Pastor Samuel looked toward Olivia, then back to Michael. "Do you still wish to marry this woman today?" The question settled over the sanctuary like fresh snow. Every guest became perfectly still. Olivia closed her eyes. She didn't plead. She didn't argue. She simply waited. Michael looked at her for a very long time. Then he looked at me. Finally. He looked toward the stained glass window behind the altar where sunlight poured across the wooden cross. When he spoke, his answer surprised every person in the church, including me. "I love Olivia." She began crying immediately, but... He took a slow breath. "I don't believe we're ready to become husband and wife." The silence that followed was even deeper than before. "I can't promise forever, until I know we can choose truth over appearance." He looked at Olivia with sadness rather than anger. "If we marry today, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering whether we built our marriage on honesty or on fear." Olivia covered her face with both hands. She nodded slowly. "I understand." Her voice cracked, and for the first time, she looked at me. "I really do." Pastor Samuel quietly closed the ceremony book. Then he smiled with remarkable peace. "I believe postponing a wedding built on truth is far holier than completing one built on pretense." Around the sanctuary, guests slowly rose to their feet. No one appeared angry. No one seemed impatient. Instead, most looked relieved, because beneath the disappointment of a canceled ceremony, everyone had witnessed something far rarer. A son had chosen integrity over pride. A mother had chosen mercy over revenge. And a family, broken only hours earlier, had finally begun telling the truth. For a few moments after Pastor Samuel officially announced that the ceremony would not continue, no one seemed to know what to do. The florist stood frozen beside the altar. The string quartet lowered their instruments. The wedding planner stared at her clipboard as though a different schedule might suddenly appear. Then something remarkable happened. No one rushed toward the exits. Instead, people stayed exactly where they were. Not because they were waiting for another ceremony, because they had just witnessed something far more meaningful than the one they had come to see. Pastor Samuel stepped forward with a gentle smile. "My friends," he said, "today may not have unfolded according to anyone's plans." A few guests chuckled quietly. "But sometimes God's greatest blessings arrive disguised as interruptions." The tension inside the sanctuary eased ever so slightly. "I think we should all give this family a little privacy." Guests began nodding. One by one, people approached Michael before leaving. No one spoke about the canceled wedding. Instead, they shook his hand. Some hugged him. Several older men simply placed a hand on his shoulder without saying a word. They understood. Certain mistakes cannot be erased. They can only become turning points. Linda was among the last to leave. She hugged me tightly. "I've known you for 20 years. I smiled weakly. "You've seen me through a lot." "I have." She looked directly into my eyes. "I've never been prouder of you than I am today." I laughed softly through tears. "I didn't feel particularly brave." "You weren't brave." She squeezed my hand. "You were kind." Her words stayed with me long after she walked away. Kind. It sounded so much smaller than forgiveness, yet somehow much harder. Within half an hour, the sanctuary had emptied. Only a handful of people remained: Pastor Samuel, Michael, Olivia, Richard, and Susan Bennett. The wedding planner quietly packed decorations in the background, wisely pretending not to hear our conversation. No one spoke for several minutes. Finally, Olivia broke the silence. "I'd like to say something." Everyone looked at her. She removed her veil slowly. Without it, she looked younger, less polished, more human. "I've spent my entire adult life believing that if everything looked perfect," she forced a sad smile, "people wouldn't notice what wasn't." Richard lowered his eyes. "I worried about matching colors." She folded the veil carefully across her arm. "I worried about photographs." Another pause. "I worried about guest lists, flower arrangements, table settings, speeches, and appearances." She looked toward me. "I never worried enough about people's hearts." No one interrupted. She continued. "When Michael proposed," her voice softened, "I honestly believed I loved him enough to become his family." She glanced toward him. "But somewhere between engagement parties and wedding planning, I started treating family like a brand." Michael looked at the floor. "I let you." She nodded sadly. "Yes. I made lists. I scheduled meetings. I approved invitations." She laughed bitterly. "I even approved where everyone would sit." Then her smile disappeared. "But I never stopped to ask myself whether I had the right to rearrange someone's place in another person's life." The sentence lingered in the quiet church. Richard slowly stood. "I need to speak." His voice was calm, not defensive, simply tired. He walked toward me until only a few feet separated us. "Eren," he paused, "I owe you more than an apology." I waited. "When Olivia was little," he smiled faintly at the memory. She used to run into every room with scraped knees because she believed I could fix anything. Olivia looked at him in surprise. I always told her the same thing. He looked at his daughter. If something breaks, find the cause before you fix the damage. He sighed deeply. Somewhere along the way, I forgot my own advice. He turned back toward me. I blamed circumstances. The guest list? The budget? The event? He slowly shook his head. But the problem wasn't the wedding. His eyes filled with regret. It was me. Susan quietly stood beside him. He isn't saying that to protect us. She reached for Richard's hand. He's saying it because it's true. Richard nodded. I taught my daughter that success opens doors. He looked around the beautiful sanctuary. I forgot to teach her that humility keeps those doors worth walking through. Silence settled once more. Then Susan stepped closer to me. I've replayed this morning over and over in my head. She swallowed. When that usher led you to the back, her voice broke. I should have gotten up. I said nothing. I knew. Another tear slipped down her cheek. I knew that seat belonged to you. She looked ashamed. But I convinced myself it was already too late. I answered quietly. It's never too late to stand up. She nodded. I know that now. Michael had remained silent throughout their apologies. Finally, he walked toward Olivia. The two of them stood facing one another in the center aisle. I need to ask you something. Olivia nodded. Anything. When you asked to replace Mom... He struggled to finish the sentence. Did you honestly think I'd be happier? She answered immediately. No. His eyebrows lifted slightly. No. No. She looked down. I thought you'd be relieved. Relieved. I knew you were uncomfortable. She wiped away another tear. I knew every conversation about your mother ended with you feeling guilty. Michael stared. So your solution was to remove her? She nodded once. I told myself I was protecting you. He closed his eyes. You were protecting me from feeling uncomfortable. Yes. But discomfort isn't always something we're supposed to escape. She nodded again. I understand that now. He took a slow breath. I should have protected my mother. And I should never have asked you not to. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Olivia reached into her bouquet. Everyone looked confused. She untied the ivory ribbon holding the flowers together, folded it carefully, then walked toward me. Eren. She held out the ribbon. I looked at it puzzled. This ribbon was supposed to wrap around my bouquet all day. She smiled sadly. I don't deserve to carry it. I frowned gently. What are you asking? She looked directly into my eyes. I'm asking if you'll keep it. Why? So every time I remember today, I'll remember that appearances can be untied. I accepted the ribbon quietly. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't meaningful to anyone else. But I understood what she was trying to say. She was surrendering the symbol of the perfect wedding she had spent months trying to create, not because someone forced her, because she no longer wanted perfection built on someone else's pain. Pastor Samuel watched the exchange with quiet satisfaction. Then he looked at Michael. My son. Michael smiled faintly. You keep calling me that. I've earned the privilege. Michael laughed through tears. You probably have. Pastor Samuel rested both hands on the lectern. I've officiated weddings for more than 40 years. He looked thoughtfully around the sanctuary. I've seen couples who smiled beautifully while hiding resentment. I've seen families who looked perfect in photographs, yet never spoke again afterward. He smiled gently, and I've seen weddings postponed that eventually became stronger marriages because people chose honesty first. He looked at Michael and Olivia together. I hope today's ending becomes the beginning you actually needed. Neither of them answered immediately. Instead, Michael reached out his hand, not as a groom, simply as a man asking another person to walk beside him honestly. Olivia looked at it, then took it. No rings were exchanged. No vows were spoken. Just one quiet decision. not to rush into forever before repairing what had been broken. As I watched them, I felt something inside me begin to loosen. The pain was still there. The disappointment hadn't disappeared. Neither had the memories of being sent to the last row. Those things would take time. But for the first time in months, I no longer felt invisible. Not because everyone had finally looked at me, because my son finally had. After the church had emptied, none of us were ready to go home. The reception hall, only a few miles away, had already been decorated. Hundreds of fresh flowers filled the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers hung above tables set for nearly 150 guests. A 5-tier wedding cake waited beneath a spotlight untouched. Months of planning, thousands of dollars, countless expectations, all standing quietly in a room that would never host the celebration it had been prepared for. The wedding planner approached Michael cautiously. "What would you like us to do?" He looked around the room. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Finally, he smiled sadly. "People shouldn't go hungry because I made mistakes." The planner looked surprised. "So, the food's already prepared." He nodded toward the ballroom. "The guests who traveled here should eat." She blinked. "You still want to hold the reception?" He shook his head. "Not a reception." He looked around the room once more. "A family meal." Those 2 words somehow changed everything. Within an hour, many guests who had been preparing to leave returned to the ballroom. There was no grand entrance, no first dance, no announcement introducing the bride and groom. The DJ quietly packed away the playlist. Instead of romantic music, soft piano melodies filled the room. People sat wherever they wished. The carefully planned seating chart no longer mattered. And somehow, the room immediately felt warmer. Linda sat beside me. Pastor Samuel joined us. A retired couple from David's old engineering company took seats across the table. For the first time all day, nobody seemed concerned about appearances. People simply talked. They laughed softly, shared memories, passed bread baskets. It felt less like a canceled wedding, and more like the kind of family gathering David had always loved. I caught Michael watching the room. He smiled faintly. "This is what Dad would have wanted." I nodded. "It is." About halfway through lunch, Michael stood. He picked up a glass, not to make a formal toast, simply because he wanted everyone to hear him. "I know many of you traveled a long way today." The conversation stopped. "I know some of you took time off work." He smiled apologetically. "And I know this wasn't the celebration anyone expected." Several guests smiled reassuringly. "I've spent most of today apologizing." A few people laughed quietly. "I'm probably going to spend the next several years doing the same." That drew a warmer laugh. Then his expression grew serious. "But there's one apology I haven't made publicly." He looked toward me. My heart immediately began racing. He walked across the ballroom until he stood beside my chair. Then, without warning, he knelt, right there beside me, exactly as he had done when he was 6 years old after accidentally breaking my favorite coffee mug. Exactly as he had done when he was 13 after lying about failing a math test. Except this time, he was 36, and every person in the room was watching. He took both my hands. "Mom," his voice shook. "I spent months worrying about impressing people who barely know me." He looked directly into my eyes, and somehow, I stopped honoring the person who gave me everything. I could already feel tears falling. "When Dad died, you became both parents." He squeezed my hands gently. "You worked until your back hurt. You skipped vacations. You wore the same winter coat for years." His voice cracked. "And I never thanked you enough." The room was silent, except for quiet sobbing from somewhere behind us. Michael continued. "I thought success meant building a bigger future." He smiled sadly. "But today I realized success means never forgetting who carried you there." He swallowed hard. "I can't change what I did." "No," I whispered. "I can't erase the pain." "No, I can't give you back this morning." Another tear rolled down his face. "No, but if you'll let me." He took a shaky breath. "I'd like to spend the rest of my life making sure you never question your place beside me again." I couldn't speak. I simply reached forward and wrapped my arms around him. The ballroom erupted into quiet applause, not loud, not forced, the kind of applause people offer when they're witnessing something honest. Later that afternoon, after many guests had gone home, only close family and a few lifelong friends remained. Michael and I stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking a small lake behind the reception hall. The October air had grown cooler. Leaves drifted gently across the water. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Michael broke the silence. "Can I ask you something?" "Always." "When did you first realize I'd changed?" The question surprised me. I thought carefully before answering. "It wasn't one moment." "What was it then?" 100 little moments." He looked down. "I stopped calling every Sunday." "Yes." "I stopped asking about your day." "Yes." "I stopped coming over." "Sometimes." He nodded slowly. "I kept thinking I'd make it up later." I smiled sadly. "Most people do." He looked at me. "Did you ever hate Olivia?" The question came so unexpectedly that I laughed softly. "No, really. I was hurt by her." He nodded. "But hate?" I shook my head. "Hate asks too much of an old heart." He smiled faintly. "I wish I thought like you." "You will. When you've lived long enough to discover that forgiveness is usually lighter than resentment." He looked across the lake. "I almost lost you." "You almost lost yourself." Our eyes met. That truth settled quietly between us. A few minutes later, Olivia walked onto the terrace. She hesitated before approaching. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Michael looked at me. I nodded. "It's all right." She stood several feet away. "I wanted to return something." She held out a small white envelope. Michael frowned. "What's that?" "The honeymoon tickets." He stared. "I canceled them." She forced a tiny smile. The travel company refunded part of the cost. She handed him the envelope. "I don't think either of us should pretend today never happened by flying somewhere beautiful tomorrow." He accepted it silently. She looked at me. "Eren?" "Yes. I don't expect us to become close overnight." "I know. I don't even know if Michael and I have a future together." She glanced toward him. "That's something we'll have to discover honestly." Michael nodded. "It is." She looked back at me. "But whether or not I ever become part of this family—" Her voice softened. "Thank you." I frowned gently. "For what?" "For refusing to humiliate me." The words caught me off guard. She smiled sadly. "You had every opportunity." She looked toward the ballroom. "You could have opened that final envelope. You could have exposed whatever secret David left behind. You could have destroyed me." I answered quietly. "That wasn't why your father-in-law left it." She looked surprised. "You don't know that." I smiled. "I knew David." She laughed softly through tears. "I suppose you did." For the first time since we'd met, the conversation between us contained no tension, only honesty. Not friendship, not yet, but honesty. Sometimes, that's where healing begins. As the sun slowly dipped toward the horizon, Pastor Samuel joined us outside. He carried the walnut box carefully in both hands. "Eren." I turned. "I believe this belongs back with you." He handed it to me. I smiled. "Thank you." He looked at Michael. "I've been thinking about that unopened envelope." Michael nodded. "So have I." Pastor Samuel smiled knowingly. "There may come a day, many years from now, when your mother is no longer here to remind you who you are." The words settled heavily over all of us. "When that day comes," he rested one hand on the box, "perhaps you'll decide to open it." Michael looked at me, then at the box. Finally he nodded. "Not today." "No," Pastor Samuel smiled. "Not today." Because today, he had remembered. 3 months passed before I heard the familiar knock on my front door. Not the quick, distracted knock Michael had developed over the last few years. This one came slowly, patiently, exactly the way David used to knock whenever he came home from a business trip. I smiled before I even reached the door. When I opened it, Michael stood there holding 2 paper grocery bags. Behind him was Olivia. Neither of them was dressed for an occasion. Michael wore blue jeans and an old Buckeyes sweatshirt I hadn't seen since college. Olivia wore a simple sweater and carried no designer handbag, no carefully arranged appearance, no polished perfection. For the first time since we'd met, she looked comfortable being exactly who she was. "Hi, Mom," I smiled. "Come in." Michael lifted the grocery bags. "We brought lunch." "You cooked," he laughed. "Let's not get carried away." Olivia smiled shyly. "We ordered from your favorite Italian restaurant." I stepped aside. "Well, that explains why it smells so good." As they entered, Olivia paused in the hallway. Her eyes moved slowly across the framed photographs covering the wall. She stopped in front of one picture. Michael at 8 years old, covered in mud, holding a fishing pole nearly twice his height while David laughed behind him. "I've never seen these." I looked at the wall. "I suppose you haven't." She continued walking. Every few feet another photograph waited. Michael in his Little League uniform, Michael winning the 8th grade science fair, Michael standing between David and me on his high school graduation day. None of the pictures were professionally taken. Some were blurry, some were crooked. One had a thumb covering the corner of the lens, but every single one held something the expensive engagement photographs never had, a real memory. Olivia smiled softly. "I understand now." I looked at her. "Understand what?" She gestured toward the hallway. "I kept trying to fit Michael into the life I wanted us to build." She swallowed. "I never stopped to learn the life that had already built him." Those words stayed with me because they were true. You cannot love someone completely if you refuse to understand where they came from. Lunch lasted nearly 3 hours. We ate too much lasagna, argued playfully over whether garlic bread should be toasted lightly or heavily. Michael insisted my sweet tea still tasted better than any restaurant's. I accused him of trying to flatter me. He admitted I was probably right. For the first time in a very long while, conversation felt effortless. No one was pretending. No one was performing. Halfway through dessert, Michael became unusually quiet. Finally, he reached into his jacket pocket. "I have something." He placed a folded document on the table. I looked at it. "What is it?" "The deed." I frowned. "To what?" "My house." I blinked. "I don't understand." He looked directly at me. "I bought it almost 2 years ago." "I know. I've been thinking a lot since the wedding." He slid the document toward me. "I've added your name." I stared at him. "What? If anything ever happens to me?" He smiled gently. "That house belongs to family." I pushed the document back. "You don't have to do this." "I know. I don't want your property." "I know. So why?" He laughed quietly. "Because it's not really about the house." He reached across the table and took my hand. "It's about making sure you never doubt your place in my life again." Tears blurred my vision. "I already believe you." "I know. But I need actions to match my words now." I looked toward Olivia. She smiled. "It was his idea." She laughed softly. "I actually argued with him." Michael grinned. "She said you'd refuse." "I almost did." "I know. But I also know you." He squeezed my hand. "You spent your whole life giving me security." "I'd like to return a little of it." I folded the document carefully, not because I wanted ownership, because I understood what it represented. Not property, trust. Over the following months, changes happened slowly, not dramatically. Real healing rarely is. Michael resumed calling every Sunday afternoon, not because I asked, because he wanted to. Sometimes we talked for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. He asked about my garden, about the ladies at the library, about whether I'd finally fixed the squeaky kitchen cabinet. He listened again, really listened. One Saturday morning, he showed up carrying a toolbox. "What are you fixing?" "Whatever's broken," I laughed. "That's a dangerous promise in this house." He spent the entire day repairing loose railings, replacing old light fixtures, cleaning gutters, and repainting the porch steps David had built decades earlier. As he worked, I watched from the porch swing. Every now and then, he'd look over and ask, "What?" I smiled. "You look like your father." He always smiled back. "I hope so." Olivia changed too, not overnight, but sincerely. She stopped trying to impress me. Instead, she began asking questions. What was Michael like at 10? Did David always tell terrible jokes? How did you two meet? One afternoon, she brought over several old photo albums she'd found while cleaning her apartment. "My parents and I have been talking a lot." She looked thoughtful. "We realized we have thousands of photographs," she smiled sadly, "and very few stories. Together we spent hours exchanging memories, some joyful, some painful. For the first time, we weren't trying to decide whether we belonged in each other's lives. We were simply learning." Months later, Richard and Susan invited me to dinner, not at their country club, not at an expensive restaurant, at their home. Susan greeted me at the door with a genuine hug. No performance, no audience, just kindness. During dessert, Richard quietly admitted something. "I spent 40 years building a successful business." He looked around his dining room. "I thought providing well meant providing wealth." He smiled at me. "You reminded me there's another kind." I nodded. "There is." He raised his coffee cup. "Thank you for teaching us, without trying to." Nearly a year after the canceled wedding, Pastor Samuel called. "Eren?" "Hello, Pastor. I have a question." "I'm listening." "The church is hosting its annual Family Appreciation Service." I smiled. "I remember. We'd like someone to share a story." I laughed softly. "I think you already know which story you're asking about." "I do." I hesitated. "I don't know if I'm the right person." "I believe you're the only person." A month later, I stood in the same sanctuary where my son's wedding had almost happened. This time, there were no flowers, no tuxedos, no wedding planner, only families sitting together in wooden pews. Michael sat beside me. Olivia sat beside him. Richard and Susan occupied the same row. When Pastor Samuel introduced me, I walked to the front of the church. I looked around, then smiled. A year ago, I believed the worst thing that could happen was losing my seat. Soft laughter drifted through the sanctuary. I was wrong. People listened quietly. The worst thing would have been losing my son. I looked toward Michael, and the best thing that happened was that the truth interrupted us before the vows did. The congregation remained silent because everyone understood. Sometimes the greatest blessing isn't the celebration that goes according to plan. It's the interruption that saves us from building the rest of our lives on the wrong foundation. Almost 2 years passed before I stood in that little stone church again. This time I arrived early on purpose, not because I was afraid of losing my seat, because I wanted a few quiet moments alone. The morning sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, painting patches of blue, gold, and crimson across the wooden pews. The sanctuary looked almost exactly as it had the day Michael's first wedding had been scheduled. Yet everything felt different. Peace has a way of changing familiar places. I walked slowly to the front row, the same pew, the same aisle, the same place where so much pain had unfolded. I rested my fingertips on the polished wood and smiled. There was no reservation card, no carefully printed title, no debate over where I belonged. I simply sat down. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. "Mom?" I turned. Michael stood there smiling. The smile reached his eyes again. It reminded me of the little boy who used to race across baseball fields looking for me in the crowd before every game. "You came early," I said. He laughed. "I learned from someone." He kissed my forehead before sitting beside me. For a while, neither of us spoke. We simply looked toward the altar. Finally, he whispered, "Do you remember the last time we were here? I don't think either of us could forget." He nodded. "I don't want to." I looked at him. "You don't." He shook his head. "If I forget that day, I might forget the lesson that came with it." Before I could answer, another familiar voice spoke behind us. I hope I'm not interrupting. "Olivia." She walked toward us wearing a simple ivory dress, not the extravagant designer gown she had worn 2 years earlier. This dress was elegant without trying to impress anyone. She smiled at me. "Good morning, Eren. You look beautiful." She laughed softly. I've learned that beautiful feels different now. I tilted my head. How so? She looked around the church. I used to think beauty meant perfection. She reached for Michael's hand. Now I think it means honesty. I smiled. I like that definition better. This day wasn't a replacement wedding. It was a new beginning. Nearly a year after the canceled ceremony, Michael and Olivia had quietly become engaged again. Not because everyone expected them to, because they had spent 11 months rebuilding what should have existed before the first engagement. They attended counseling together. They learned how to argue without winning. They learned how to apologize without excuses. Most importantly, they learned that marriage isn't something you perform for guests. It's something you practice long before anyone watches. Richard and Susan changed as well. Richard retired from his company earlier than planned. He once admitted to me that success had finally become less important than being present. Susan began volunteering twice a week at a community literacy program. The woman who had once worried endlessly about appearances now spent Tuesday mornings helping children learn to read. Life has a funny way of humbling us. Sometimes the lessons arrive gently. Sometimes they arrive in front of 100 wedding guests. Pastor Samuel entered the sanctuary carrying his familiar leather folder. He smiled when he saw me. "I believe you're sitting in the correct place this time." I laughed. "I think so too." He looked toward Michael. "Anything you'd like to change before we begin?" Michael stood. "Actually," he turned toward the guests who had begun filling the pews. "I do." The room became quiet. He walked to the microphone near the altar. "I'd like to ask someone to join me." He looked directly at me. "Mom!" My heart skipped. "Would you walk with me?" For a second I couldn't move. The question echoed through the church, not because of its volume, because of what it meant. 2 years earlier, another woman had been asked to take my place. Now, my son was asking for it back. Tears filled my eyes. I stood slowly. When I reached him, he offered his arm, just as a groom might offer it to the woman who had carried him through life. As we walked together toward the altar, I noticed something unexpected. Many guests were crying. Even people who had never witnessed the first wedding had heard the story. Not because anyone wanted sympathy, because truth has a way of traveling farther than pride ever does. When we reached the front, Michael turned to face everyone. "I'd like to say something before Pastor Samuel begins." He looked toward me. "My father once wrote that gratitude is the strongest foundation any home will ever have." He smiled. I didn't understand those words the first time I stood here. He gently squeezed my hand. "I do now." Then in front of every guest, he turned fully toward me. "I spent too many years thanking people for what they gave me, while forgetting to thank the person who gave me everything." His voice trembled. "So before I become someone's husband, I want to honor the woman who first taught me what love looked like." He embraced me. The church filled with warm applause. When we stepped apart, Pastor Samuel smiled. "I think we're finally ready." This ceremony was simple. No elaborate speeches, no unnecessary traditions, just promises, real ones. When Pastor Samuel asked who supported this marriage, he didn't read from a prepared script. Instead, he smiled toward me. "Eren Ozmen, do you give your blessing freely?" I looked at Michael, then at Olivia. "I do, with all my heart." The ceremony continued without interruption. No confusion, no hidden agendas, no altered documents, only truth. After Michael and Olivia exchanged vows, Pastor Samuel pronounced them husband and wife. The church erupted in joyful applause. As they walked back down the aisle together, Michael suddenly stopped. He looked over his shoulder. "Mom, yes, we're forgetting someone." He smiled. He reached for my hand again, and together, the three of us walked down the aisle, not because tradition required it, because family did. That evening, after the reception had ended and the last guests had gone home, I returned to my house alone. The quiet no longer felt lonely. It felt peaceful. I placed David's walnut box on the dining room table. For a long time, I simply looked at it. Then I opened it once more. Everything remained exactly where it had been. The photographs, the old wallet, the letter, and the sealed envelope, still unopened. I smiled. I think we did all right. The room was silent, yet somehow I could almost hear David laughing softly. I picked up the envelope, turned it over once, then placed it back inside the box. Some secrets are meant to protect people, not punish them. This one had protected a family for 20 years without ever being opened. Perhaps that had always been its true purpose. I closed the lid gently. The brass latch clicked into place. This time, not because a chapter was being hidden, because it had finally come to rest. As I turned off the dining room light, I looked once more at the family photographs lining the hallway. David, Michael, me, and now one new frame waiting to be hung. A picture taken that afternoon, 3 people walking down the church aisle together. No one standing in someone else's place, exactly where we belonged. Life has taught me that love is not measured by grand celebrations, expensive venues, or perfect photographs. Those things fade with time. Flowers wilt. Music ends. Even the happiest wedding day eventually becomes another page in a family album. What remains is how we treat one another when no one is applauding. Gratitude is one of the easiest gifts to forget because it asks for nothing except remembrance. The people who love us most often stand quietly in the background. They rarely demand recognition. They simply keep showing up, sacrificing, forgiving, and hoping that one day we'll understand what they carried for us. Parents are not perfect. Children are not perfect. Marriage is not perfect. Families never are. But honesty has an incredible way of healing what pride only hides. I learned that forgiveness does not erase painful memories. Instead, it frees us from allowing those memories to decide the rest of our lives. Forgiveness is not saying that what happened was acceptable. It is choosing not to let bitterness become the final chapter. If you are fortunate enough to still have a parent who loves you, call them. Visit them. Listen to their stories, even the ones you've heard before. One day those stories will become treasures you wish you could hear just one more time. And if you're a parent carrying silent heartbreak, never underestimate the power of quiet love. Sometimes the seeds you planted years ago bloom long after you thought they had been forgotten. Thank you for walking this journey with me. If this story touched your heart, I'd truly love to hear from you. Please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this story stayed with you the most? Have you ever experienced a moment when forgiveness changed your family? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more heartfelt stories, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I read your comments, and they remind me that no matter where we live, family, love, and hope speak the same language.